Okay, wonderful. Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Brummer, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Institute of International Economic Law's Q&A discussion with David Cohen. Bill Traynor will be introducing David in just a couple of seconds, but as the director, I wanted to kick things off first with a big word of thanks to the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council has been our partner in helping to organize this event, helping to do a lot of the important work with not only other regulators, but also some of our foreign partners and friends at embassies across the city. I also wanted to just give a word or two on the Institute of International Economic Law, since I see a good number of students here. The Institute of International Economic Law was founded by the late John Jackson, and the focus over a decade ago was that on international trade. But over the last decade or so, the Institute has grown to cover a number of other issues as well, including economic sanctions, financial regulation, monetary affairs, and international tax. And we have here one of the largest faculties focusing on these issues, and we like to do things in an interdisciplinary way that takes an interesting take on international economic and global affairs. That is, to integrate an interdisciplinary analysis into real-world affairs, talking to many of our leaders here in Washington who are on the front lines of managing and navigating issues that have global import. And we've just been very fortunate to have many of these leaders here, and today's Q&A will be a continuation of our series of conversations. Throughout the changes at the Institute of International Economic Law, our Dean, Bill Traynor, has been at the helm. He's been side by side helping the international law faculty and the larger Washington, D.C. community think through how our academic programming as a law school can help to inform policymakers, market participants, diplomats, CEOs, regulators, and others. And it's been a pleasure working with him. Bill also has a particular interest in today's talk. Bill was, before becoming a law professor, he was involved in government. And he served as the Deputy Assistant General in the Office of the Legal Counsel of the U.S. Department of Justice. And before that, he was the Associate Counsel of the Office of Independent Counsel during the Iran-Contra investigation, the gift that kept giving for a while. As a result, I really did want to have Bill here have the honors of doing the introductions for David and to help shepherd us into our discussion today. So, Bill Traynor.
Well, I want to thank you, Chris, for that very kind and generous introduction, and to welcome you all to Georgetown Law and to this very important discussion. Let me begin by thanking the Institute of International Economic Law for having put together today's event. Under Chris's leadership, IAEL has grown to become one of the premier forums for policy discussions, and I really want to recognize him for having conceptualized the role that IAEL can play and then making it a reality. Over the last 2 years, and with the active participation of nearly a dozen renowned faculty members in finance, tax, and trade, we've enjoyed cutting-edge programming with ambassadors, general counsel, regulators, and CEOs, and we're delighted to once again welcome reporters, C-SPAN, students, and leaders of the Washington policymaking community. And echoing Chris, I also want to say how pleased we are to be co-sponsoring today's events with the Atlantic Council. Georgetown, the IAEL, and the Atlantic Council share a common goal of promoting constructive leadership and engagement in international affairs. In today's increasingly complex world, it's imperative that we do all we can to promote just that, constructive leadership and engagement in international law and policy. And that's what IAEL is about. And it's just a delight to have the Atlantic Council join with us here today. Now, David, we're particularly honored to have you here with us today. Before getting into our Q&A, first of all, let me begin by thanking you for the government service you've rendered. That's something that we particularly value at Georgetown Law, and we value it always, but particularly on this, this very significant day. Today is the anniversary of September 11th, 2001. And that date always gives one pause to reflect on where we are as a nation, what we value, and what we stand for. The day provides a collective moment of introspection. And this has never been truer than it is today. And it's never been more necessary than it is today, as we face enormous national security and other challenges that will shape global economic governance, the international order, and perhaps the very future of our democracy. So it's therefore fitting that we gather together today on the anniversary of 9/11 with these discussants to examine the current and evolving U.S. sanctions regimes as they pertain to Russia, Venezuela, and North Korea, all nations that are the subject of potentially serious geopolitical discussion. And while Russia, Venezuela, and North Korea are in the news quite a bit these days, there seems to be less than optimal public understanding of the different sanction regimes, their likely success, and the national security issues that drive the background. So, and that's why we're so honored and we're just lucky to welcome David here today. David Cohen served as Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency from 2015 to 2017. As the agency's second in command, he managed the CIA's domestic and worldwide operations and oversaw its strategic modernization. He also led the agency's performance of its 5 core missions: foreign intelligence collection, all-source analysis, covert action, counterintelligence, and foreign liaison relationships. In addition, David led special projects focusing on the impact of new technologies on the agency and how best to work with U.S. companies to advance the CIA's mission. And notably, in light of our conversation today, David served as the CIA's second most senior official during the Russia hacking investigation. At the conclusion of his tenure, David was awarded the Director's Award and the Distinguished Intelligence Medal, which is the agency's highest honor. Before becoming Deputy Director, David already had a remarkable record of public service. He served for 6 years in the U.S. Department of Treasury in 2 key positions responsible for following the money. From 2011 to 15, he was the Senate-confirmed Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. As Undersecretary, he directed the Treasury Department's policy, enforcement, regulatory, and intelligence functions aimed at identifying and disrupting financial support to nations, organizations, and individuals posing a threat to national security. And he also directed 2 key regulatory agencies, the Office of Foreign Assets Control and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. He was also instrumental in developing and implementing the financial sanctions regime that brought Iran to the negotiating table, that imposed costs on Russia and President Putin for the invasion of Crimea and the fomenting of unrest in eastern Ukraine, and that deprived al-Qaeda, ISIL, and other terrorist organizations of access to funding. He also led the Treasury Department's effort to combat domestic and international money laundering and financial terrorism. So it's really, and before that he was the Treasury Department's Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing. It's a remarkable record of public service. He's a unique person to be able to have this conversation today. He's got an unmatched knowledge of terrorism, money laundering, and nuclear programs, and a deep sense of where these issues intersect in the most dangerous corners of the globe. So although he's returned, this is the infomercial segment. He's returned to Wilmer Hale to focus on cybersecurity and CFIUS. I have to say, I'm so grateful that he's here today. I want to thank him again for his public service. And I have to say, I feel like we have a protagonist in a John le Carré novel joining us on stage. So welcome, David, and let me turn matters over to David and Chris.
Thank you so much, Bill. Okay, well, I guess it's good to just sort of jump right into things, David. As an introductory question, I think we should have a bit of a framing conversation. What, right now, would you say is the state of play when it relates to sanctions? And how would you see the Trump administration's conduct and use and deployment of sanctions as being different from that of the Obama administration?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me thank you, Chris, for inviting me. Very excited to be here, have the opportunity to talk about, which I think are some of the most fascinating issues, which is the interplay of foreign policy, national security, and the tools that we've developed over the years to try and advance U.S. interests. And it's great to be here at Georgetown to do that. And I don't know if Bill's still here, but that was a ridiculous introduction. And you must never, ever do that again. Thank you. So the state of play of sanctions is that I think as we sit here on 9/11/2017, and I think Dean Traynor is right, it is appropriate to take a moment to reflect on what today's anniversary means, and it means something in the sanctions world that obviously means much more as a country. So I'm actually delighted to be able to talk about how sanctions can be a part of our counterterrorism efforts on this anniversary. But to answer your question, I think as we sit here today, financial sanctions in particular have become an accepted and embedded tool of our national security and foreign policy. That has been an evolution over time. I think it was something that during the Obama administration and really going back to the Bush administration, a lot of effort was put into trying to change the landscape of the sanctions law and sanctions tools so that we can have something that's much more nimble, much more effective. And so I think, today you pick up the paper, whatever the national security issue is, whether it's North Korea, Venezuela, Russia, terrorism, Syria, name your issue. Sanctions is a component of the conversation. And I think one sort of very interesting, it's a small point, but it's an interesting reflection of this, is there was legislation enacted earlier this year. I think it was actually part of the big Russia, Iran, North Korea legislation. So a provision in there that made the Secretary of the Treasury a statutory member of the National Security Council. When the NSC was established in 1950, you'll know the answer to that, several decades ago. It was a list of cabinet officials who were statutory members of the NSC. Secretary of the Treasury was not. Now, as a matter of practice, over the years, Secretary of the Treasury and always been his designee, has been present for NSC meetings, for deputies meetings, what have you. But it's now reflected in law that Treasury is in the NSC, and I think that is because there's an appreciation that the sanctions tool is a key part of what we do. Now, in terms of what has changed between the Obama administration and the Trump administration, and one of the things that we tried very hard to do in the Obama administration was to use sanctions as a tool for a broader policy objective. We were very cognizant of the fact that sanctions are not a policy unto themselves. You don't just apply sanctions and hope that something good will happen. You apply sanctions principally to try to do one of two things, either to affect behavior, to try and persuade whoever is on the receiving end of the sanctions to change what they're doing, whether it's a policy or a conduct. And then the other objective is to disrupt and disable. And in particular, if you look at the counterterrorist financing sanctions, it's the principal objective there was to cut off the lines of financing. And so, the best example in the Obama administration of how we tried to do this was with Iran. The sanctions that we imposed on Iran and continued to ratchet up and expand in, I think, ways that we should talk about was all part of what we call the dual track strategy, which was on the one hand to continue to apply increasing pressure on Iran, but to always on the other side of the track offer the opportunity for engagement. And as everybody knows, we got to a point where the Iranians said, okay, we're ready to talk. After a number of fits and starts where I think, candidly, the sanctions were not intense enough to get them over that hump, they got to the point where they understood that it was in their interest to negotiate rather than to continue to defy the international community. So we tried to merge sanctions with a policy objective. Now, in the Trump administration, and it's still early, and this may change as they sort of find their footing a little bit more, there is clearly a continued reliance on sanctions. You've seen it in Venezuela, where they have issued really two different types of sanctions, sort of the standard additional sanctions that are designed to disable and disrupt, but then recently, just a few weeks ago, some very interesting financial sanctions aimed at the Venezuelan government's ability to finance itself. So there's a lot of continued use of sanctions in Venezuela. There's a lot of talk in North Korea. There's some discussion, of course, of whether to relieve the sanctions on Russia. But what we don't see, I think, quite yet is a close tie between the use of sanctions and a policy objective. I have tried to figure out what our policy is in Venezuela. I think it's interesting. And other than as an expression of revulsion of what's going on there, which is a worthy and appropriate reaction, it's not clear to me that the sanctions that we're applying are designed to achieve a particular outcome. Likewise, and we should talk about North Korea as well, it's sort of unclear how the sanctions that have been discussed with respect to North Korea are tied to what our North Korea policy is, and I think that's in large part because we don't know what our North Korea policy is. So I think that's a distinction that, as I said, it may cure itself over time as the Trump administration refines and defines its policy to a greater extent in these various fora. But that's an area where I think there's a little difference.
Well, we certainly do see at the moment an effort just today over in New York at the United Nations. The Trump administration is seeking to, in effect, stiffen sanctions internationally. I guess tied to your earlier question, number one, how important is the multilateralization of sanctions in order to achieve policy objectives, and does it differ dramatically across different countries, number one? And then number two, does that multilateralization process inherently require more strategic thinking when it comes to policy objectives?
Yeah. The multilateralization of sanctions is essential for them to be truly effective. That one of the reasons that financial sanctions work, just to be totally candid, is that we have the world's most important economy, the world's most important financial sector. The U.S. dollar is the currency of choice for a huge proportion of international transactions. Those dollar transactions, whether the transaction is between Belgium and Azerbaijan, if it's a dollar-denominated transaction, it's going to come through New York. And so we have an enormous positional advantage in developing financial sanctions here in the United States because we have jurisdiction that expands around the world. That being said, for sanctions to truly be effective, you need international buy-in. You need other countries not just to be forced to have their businesses and their people subject in some respect to our sanctions in some instances, but you want those countries to embrace the policy objective. That was critical in the Iran context, and you can see it as an important part of the discussion with North Korea. And so going back repeatedly to the UN Security Council to get resolutions that impose sanctions, and that also, importantly, these resolutions don't just impose sanctions, they also establish the international community's uniform judgment on what North Korea is doing. And that is an important aspect of developing this policy consensus, so that you have countries around the world sort of magnifying what we're doing domestically with what they can do under their own laws.
So if I don't want to put certainly words into your mouth, but what I'm getting a sense of is, number one, when you're trying to impose and persecute your international strategy, number one, you should have a strategy. But then that gets to the question as to what that strategy is.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, it can be to achieve a certain foreign policy objective. But then you're also asking or you're implying that economic sanctions may not necessarily be the best tool to use if what you're trying to do is not necessarily change behavior, but to either express opprobrium or to punish just for the sake of punishing.
Right. Well, I mean, one of the fundamental precepts of sanctions is that they're not punitive. Okay? The idea underlying sanctions is they're administrative action. I mean, so we're in a law school. I'll do like a 30 seconds on the law part here, right? When the basic governing statute is IEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, that gives the president the authority to issue an executive order that then delegates the authority to impose sanctions. It's an administrative process. The Office of Foreign Assets Control in the Treasury Department is an administrative agency that actually applies the sanctions based on the executive order that the president signs that sets out the criteria. But the idea is that if the person who is subject to the sanction changes their behavior and is no longer doing whatever it is that got them sanctioned, that the sanctions will be lifted, they'll be delisted. And OFAC every year delists hundreds and hundreds of people and companies because they have made the case that they are no longer doing what it is that got them sanctioned. So bearing in mind that the idea behind sanctions is to change behavior, it isn't a great tool to punish. And it, frankly, I think confuses the use of sanctions and in some respects impairs the ability to get international consensus around the use of sanctions if it is viewed as purely a punitive tool.
To that end, and this gets back to our initial question, because I think there's a lot more to flesh out, what is it about the sanctions, and I guess we can go country by country, but do you see any limitations in the sanctions strategy in terms of achieving even the objectives that you sought and your colleagues sought in the Obama administration? Do you see any deployment of the sanction strategy now that would at least undermine some of the U.S. policy interests and strategy that you had 6 to 9 months ago? Beginning, I should start with North Korea.
Look, so North Korea is to state the obvious, a really interesting case. North Korea has been subject to sanctions for many years, and there's some view among those who follow this that sanctions have been totally ineffective and that sanctions cannot be part of the solution to the North Korea problem. My view is that that's not right. That if you allow for the possibility that there is a negotiated resolution of some sort with North Korea that will tamp down